quiet harbor, a vanished life, and an island that never stops whispering. Welcome to Echo Files. I am your host, Walter Finch. Share in the comments where you're joining from. Hearing from you makes every story more alive. Let's dive in. On a cool May morning, the sleepy village of St. Hilary-on-Sea seemed untouched by the restless tides that lapped at the jagged coastline beyond its cobbled lanes. The sea mist hung low, curling like ghostly fingers around the rooftops, and the first sunlight shimmered over the water, revealing the silhouette of Three Shadows Isle, a lonely outcrop of rock and windswept pines just half a mile from shore. It was the kind of place villagers spoke of in passing, mostly in whispers. Its name conjuring old sailors' tales of wrecks, whispers in the wind, and misfortune that befell those who lingered there too long. Miss Jane Marple, visiting for the spring holiday with her old school friend Mrs. Sylvia Partridge, found herself staring at the island that morning from the neat rose garden of Gull's Rest Cottage. A soft shawl around her shoulders, she observed the distant shape of the isle with mild curiosity. A fisherman's boat bobbed near the rocks, its figure hunched and solitary in the mist. It struck her as a place that had seen much but spoken little, quite like the old ladies who sat at the back pew of St. Hilary's church. "Ah, Jane," said Sylvia, bustling out with a tray of tea. "Do stop gazing at that wretched island. It's not as romantic as it looks, full of gulls and seaweed and dangerous crags. They say it whispers at night. But I expect that's only the wind." Miss Marple smiled benignly. "The wind is often blamed for what human hearts cannot explain, my dear. And such names as Three Shadows rarely come without a history." Sylvia placed the tray down and lowered her voice conspiratorially. "There's a history, yes. A drowning years ago. And an old fisherman swears the island curses anyone who lands there after dark. But you know these village stories. We thrive on a little drama, especially when the season is quiet." The day promised more excitement than usual. A garden fete was planned on the green near the harbor to welcome summer visitors, and nearly the whole village was attending. Stalls selling scones and rock candy, a fortune-teller's tent, and a brass band lent the scene a cheerful air. Children darted between bunting-strung tables, while women in pastel dresses gossiped over teacups. Miss Marple, never one to miss the patterns of village life, seated herself near the bandstand and watched with her usual gentle attentiveness. She noted the groups forming and reforming. Captain Reginald Weatherby, a retired naval officer with a booming voice and a tendency to recount tales of heroism to anyone within earshot. Mrs. Lucinda Claypole, the vicar's wife, fluttering anxiously from stall to stall, as if the moral success of the fete depended solely upon her lemon drizzle cake. Young Henry Dawlish, the innkeeper's son, whose surly glances toward the fortune-teller's tent revealed some private irritation. And Mr. Ambrose Fielding, a reclusive artist known for his moody seascapes, sketchbook in hand, gazing more at the distant island than the festive crowd. It was during the raffle drawing that the peace of St. Hilary shattered. A sudden shout arose from the direction of the harbor. Heads turned, voices rose, and the brass band stumbled to a halt. Two fishermen ran up the sloping green, one waving his arms wildly. "It's Mr. Pelham!" the taller one cried. "Drifted ashore, dead as driftwood." The words rippled through the crowd like a cold wind. Mrs. Claypole let out a gasp, dropping her plate of sponge cake. Young Henry turned pale and darted a look toward the fortune-teller's tent, while Captain Weatherby muttered something about blasted bad luck and stomped toward the commotion. Miss Marple rose calmly, her pale blue eyes sharpening as if a curtain had lifted behind them. "Which Mr. Pelham might that be?" she asked gently. Old Jacob Pelham, ma'am, the fisherman said, hat in hand. Found him by the rocks of Three Shadows, boat smashed to bits. A hush settled over the fete. The only sound was the distant call of gulls circling the misty isle. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the faint outline of the island, and the softest murmur escaped her lips, unheard by the villagers. "I wonder," she said, "if the island has begun whispering again." The fete, once lively with chatter and music, dissolved into a murmuring throng. Villagers clustered in small knots, whispering with wide-eyed urgency, their faces drawn tight with the mixture of dread and curiosity that only sudden death can inspire. Even the gulls seemed quieter now, wheeling above the misty harbor as if sensing the shift in mood. Miss Marple, walking at a pace that never seemed hurried, moved toward the harbor alongside Sylvia Partridge. Her friend's lips were pressed thin in disapproval, not at the death, but at the shameful eagerness with which neighbors devoured the news. "Really, Jane," Sylvia said under her breath, "you would think the king himself had been murdered from the way they're gawping. Poor Mr. Pelham. Though, I can't say I'm surprised. He always did have a reckless streak with those tides." Miss Marple tilted her head, listening without comment as they approached the quay. A small crowd had formed near the water's edge, and Constable George Miller, a burly young man with a perpetually flustered expression, was attempting to keep them back. In the shallows lay the broken remnants of a fishing boat, its bow cracked like an eggshell against the rocks. A pair of fishermen, still dripping from their efforts, carried the lifeless form of Jacob Pelham up the stones toward a waiting cart. His sea-roughened face was gray, his eyes mercifully closed. "Stand back, all of you," the constable barked, his voice trembling slightly with the weight of unexpected authority. "This is a police matter now." Miss Marple, unobtrusive as ever, drew closer just as Dr. Lionel Shaw, the village physician, crouched by the body. He pressed his fingers to Pelham's throat, shook his head, and muttered something to the constable. Miss Marple could hear, for she had perfected the art of listening where she appeared not to. No water in the lungs. Dead before he hit the sea, I'd wager. That soft declaration rippled through the crowd almost faster than the constable could hush them. It seemed the entire village inhaled sharply as one. Not an accident, then. Not a foolish old fisherman taken by the tides. A thin voice broke the tension. Murder, then? It came from Mrs. Claypole, who immediately clapped a hand to her mouth as if trying to push the word back in. "Now, nobody's saying that?" Constable Miller blustered, though the flush rising in his cheeks betrayed his unease. "Could have been, well, heart trouble or such. We'll leave that to the coroner." Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the man's weathered hands, curled into an almost peaceful repose. She noted the torn sleeve, the scrape on his left knuckle, and the curious absence of the small silver locket he was never seen without. Pelham was a man of superstitions. He swore the locket, containing a faded photograph of his long-lost wife, kept him safe on the water. She made no comment, only filed the detail away in the quiet, orderly manner of her mind. As the body was covered and wheeled away toward the vicarage hall, temporarily serving as a mortuary, the villagers dispersed in slow trickles. Conversations sprang up like weeds. Some insisted that Pelham had enemies, others that the island itself had claimed him. The name Three Shadows passed from lip to lip, its syllables darkened with fresh weight. Miss Marple allowed Sylvia to lead her back toward the green, where the fete had all but dissolved. A few stubborn children still clutched rock candy, eyes wide, sensing the day had turned into a story they would retell for months. Captain Weatherby was holding forth to a semicircle of eager listeners, his white mustache bristling. Mark my words, it was the smuggling business come back to haunt him. I said years ago, Pelham knew more than he ever let on about what washed ashore on Three Shadows. You don't fish those waters all your life without making enemies. Across the green, young Henry Dawlish stood apart, hands shoved deep in his pockets, staring at the ground as though it might swallow him. When the fortune-teller, Madame Zara, a dark-eyed woman draped in purple, touched his arm, he flinched visibly before muttering something and walking away. Miss Marple's eyes followed the brief interaction, her mind filing another small card in its invisible cabinet. The police inquiry began before the sun had fully dipped behind the pines. Constable Miller, under the distant guidance of Inspector Alderton from the neighboring town, made the rounds. He questioned the fisherman first, then any villager who had last seen Pelham alive. It was said he had been out in his boat the previous evening, as he often was, despite the heavy mist. No one admitted to seeing him land on the isle, though one fisherman swore he saw a lantern flicker among the rocks around midnight. By early evening, the village had settled into a tense quiet, broken only by the distant crash of waves. Sylvia tried to tempt Miss Marple into an early supper, but the old lady preferred to sit by the parlor window of Gull's Rest cottage, her knitting needles idle in her lap. Across the water, the outline of Three Shadows grew darker, three jagged silhouettes against the dimming sky. "Strange, isn't it?" she said softly to Sylvia. "How death seems to follow a certain pattern. Not in its cause, but in the ripples it leaves. A stone thrown into a still pond." Sylvia sighed, fussing with the teacups. "You mean the gossip? Well, that's human nature, Jane. People love to talk." "Yes," Miss Marple said, her gaze never leaving the distant isle. "And in talk, they often reveal far more than they intend. Did you notice how young Henry avoided looking at the fortune-teller today?" Sylvia blinked. "Why, no. I was far too occupied trying to keep Mrs. Claypole from fainting." A small thing, perhaps. But I often find that small things have a way of fitting together, like pieces of a puzzle no one else realizes is on the table. Her eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but in that peculiar alertness she wore like a second skin. Somewhere between the jagged rocks and the soft lamplight of the village, the first threads of the mystery had begun to weave themselves into a pattern only she seemed to notice. And though she said nothing further that evening, Miss Marple knew one thing with quiet certainty. Jacob Pelham's death was not an isolated accident. It was the first whisper of a story the island had been keeping for years, and the truth, like the tide, would eventually reach the shore. The following morning dawned with a brittle brightness, the kind that made the sea sparkle deceptively calm, belying the grim discovery of the day before. St. Hilary-on-Sea was quieter than usual. Curtains twitched as early risers peered out onto the lane, and only a few gulls wheeled overhead. For all its charm, the village had an undercurrent of unease, like a piano string pulled taut. Miss Marple, always up with the first kettle, sat at Sylvia Partridge's breakfast table, her hands neatly folded around a cup of tea. Sylvia rattled the morning paper open and shut, muttering about the lack of real information. "They've barely printed a word," she complained. "Just local fishermen found dead." As if Jacob Pelham hadn't lived here his whole life. No mention of the island at all. They're calling it an unfortunate accident, which it clearly isn't. "You heard Dr. Shaw," Miss Marple nodded gently. "The absence of water in his lungs is rather telling, yes. But the police will need proof, not whispers." She buttered her toast with calm precision. Proof often comes from listening closely to the whispers all the same. A knock at the door interrupted them. Sylvia bustled off to answer, returning moments later with Constable Miller, cap in hand, looking slightly overwhelmed. "Begging your pardon, Mrs. Partridge, Miss Marple," he said. "But Inspector Alderton's arrived from Bexley and asked me to start collecting statements. He suggested I speak with anyone who might have seen Pelham the day before last." "Of course," Miss Marple said pleasantly, her eyes as mild as a spring sky. "Would you like some tea first, Constable?" Investigating on an empty stomach is never wise. He accepted a cup with visible gratitude, and in that small pause, Miss Marple gleaned what she needed. Miller was green and nervous. Alderton would be methodical, but likely too eager to settle on a simple explanation if it quieted the village quickly. She would have to listen carefully to what others overlooked. They began their rounds on the harbor, where the remnants of Pelham's boat were stacked like broken bones against the quay. Salt water dripped from the cracked planks, leaving dark stains on the stone. Two fishermen, Tom Bickley and Alf Hargreaves, stood nearby, speaking in low tones that immediately shifted to respectful silence when the constable approached. "Morning, gentlemen," Miller said, chest puffed slightly. "We'll need your statements proper now. You were the ones who found him, eh?" "Aye," Tom said, his weathered face grave. "Boat come floating in the tide like a bit of driftwood. Pelham was tangled in the netting. Never seen him like that. And I've seen men pulled from the sea before." "Did you notice anything unusual?" Miss Marple asked softly, in that way that never seemed intrusive. The men exchanged a glance. It was Alf who spoke. "Just the locket, ma'am. Pelham never went out without it. Said his wife kept him safe, but it weren't on him." Miss Marple inclined her head, as if the thought were merely a curiosity. "I suppose it could have been lost in the water." "Maybe," Alf said, but his tone was unconvinced. Before leaving, Miss Marple wandered along the edge of the quay, her eyes on the damp stones. She crouched briefly, noting the faint scuff of a boot near the mooring post, far from where Pelham usually tied his boat. Perhaps nothing, but her mind tucked it away, with the missing locket and the scrape on his hand. By mid-morning, the inspector had gathered the quay villagers at the vicarage hall. The body had been moved to a back room for the coroner's examination, leaving the main space free for interviews. Miss Marple, though not officially invited, arrived with a basket of scones for the constable and positioned herself in a quiet corner, knitting in hand. No one thought to send her away. After all, she was just visiting, and always so sweetly harmless. The first to be questioned was Captain Weatherby. He puffed himself up and declared his suspicions loudly. "I've said it before, and I'll say it again. Smuggling," he boomed. "Pelham knew too much. Mark my words, these quiet villages are never as quiet as they seem." Alderton, a neat man with a clipped mustache, frowned. "Do you have any evidence of this supposed smuggling, Captain?" "Evidence? Well, no, not exactly. But I saw lights on that island 2 nights ago. Don't tell me gulls are lighting lanterns." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. Lights at night. That aligned with the fisherman's story. Next came Henry Dawlish, shifting uncomfortably in his chair. His mother ran the local inn, but Henry had recently returned from a short, unsuccessful stint in London. His reputation for sulkiness was well earned. "Where were you the night Pelham died?" Alderton asked. "Home," Henry muttered. "Went up early, didn't see nothing." Miss Marple, glancing up briefly from her knitting, caught the twitch of his jaw, the way his fingers curled against his knees. A young man frightened, perhaps guilty, perhaps only of a secret not yet tied to death. When Alderton pressed him about his unease at the fete, Henry stammered something about hating crowds and fled as soon as he was dismissed. Then came Madame Zara, the fortune-teller. She glided into the hall with a faint jingle of bracelets, smiling too widely. "I can tell you what I saw in the cards," she said, offering her hands dramatically. The old man was surrounded by water and shadow. The island calls the lonely, you know. Some deaths are foretold. The inspector was not amused. "Did you see Pelham the day before he died?" "A brief glimpse," she said airily. "He came by my tent at the fete, though he did not wish his fortune read." Miss Marple's needles paused for a single heartbeat. That was a curious lie, or at least a twist of the truth. Pelham had died before the fete began. Everyone knew it now. Why claim he had approached her? A small bid to seem important, perhaps, or to distract from something else. By afternoon, the investigation had yielded little but whispers and the missing locket. The coroner had yet to provide a report, though Dr. Shaw's quiet aside to the constable suggested a blow to the head had been the likely cause. Miss Marple and Sylvia walked along the path toward the churchyard, where the sea could be seen glittering beyond the low stone wall. "You heard what she said, Jane," Sylvia muttered. "The fortune-teller is lying. Everyone knows Pelham was already gone by fete day. But why lie?" "People lie for all sorts of reasons," Miss Marple said serenely. "Sometimes to hide guilt, sometimes merely to draw a curtain between themselves and the world. But often, my dear, it is the small, unnecessary lies that prove most revealing." She paused by the wall and looked toward Three Shadows Isle. The tide was higher now, curling around the jagged edges of the rocks. A cormorant perched on the tallest crag, wings spread like a dark omen. "Do you suppose," Sylvia asked, shivering slightly, "that anyone actually went to that island the night Pelham died?" "I would suppose someone did," Miss Marple said, her voice light, "because poor Jacob Pelham did not knock himself unconscious and remove his own locket. No, someone was there with him. Perhaps someone who hoped the tide would carry the truth away." She resumed her walk, mind quietly spinning its threads. Already the pattern was beginning to form. Not clear enough to speak, but enough for her to know that this death was no random stroke of fate. Somewhere in the village, someone was carrying the weight of a secret, and soon enough, the island would whisper it into the open. The next morning broke with a pale mist clinging to the harbor, softening the outlines of the fishing boats and making the cottages of Saint Hilary-on-Sea appear like faded watercolor sketches. It was the sort of weather that invited quiet reflection. And for Miss Marple, quiet reflection often yielded the clearest insights. Sylvia Partridge had gone into the village early to fetch a few necessities, leaving Miss Marple alone in the cottage parlor with a small writing desk and her knitting bag. She was not writing, nor knitting, but rather sifting through the fragments of human behavior she had observed over the past 2 days. In her mind's eye, she saw them arranged like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. The missing locket, the scuffed stone at the key, Henry Dawlish's nervous fingers, Madame Zara's flamboyant lie, and the whisper of lights seen on the island. The clock struck 9 when a brisk knock sounded on the door. Miss Marple rose to answer it, finding Constable Miller outside, his cheeks pink from the morning chill, and his expression somewhere between flustered and uncertain. "Beg pardon, Miss Marple," he said, "but the inspector thought it best I check if you'd seen anything. Or, well, if you'd heard anything. People tend to talk to you." Miss Marple's smile was as mild as ever. Well, one does hear the odd whisper, Constable, but whispers need careful weighing before they become useful. He shifted on his feet. Doctor, Shaw's given his preliminary report. Pelham died from a blow to the back of the head. Not accidental, he says. And the coroner's noting an abrasion on his right hand, like he grabbed at something rough. Rope burn, maybe? Miss Marple inclined her head. Interesting. That would suggest a struggle, or at least an attempt to hold on. Yes, ma'am. Inspector Alderton's getting rather set on young Henry Dawlish. Says he's a shifty sort and someone saw him skulking near the quay the night before last. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. I should like a small walk, Constable. The mist is most restorative for the mind. The village was slowly waking up. The bell at St. Hilary's Church rang the hour, echoing through the damp air, while shopkeepers unlatched their shutters. Miss Marple made her way down to the quay, her eyes taking in the smallest details. The moss between the stones, the lingering fish scales glinting in the pale light. The footprints left in the soft mud where the tide had recently withdrawn. She paused at the very mooring where Pelham's boat would have been tied. The scuffed stone she had noted the previous day caught her attention again, this time more clearly in the light. It wasn't a scuff so much as a deep gouge, as though metal had scraped against it. Anchor dragged, maybe, said a voice behind her. She turned to find Alf Hargreaves, the fisherman, standing there with a coil of rope over his shoulder. Pelham never scraped his boat like that, Alf continued. Always careful he was. But someone tied up clumsy here 2 nights ago. I'd swear to it. Miss Marple considered this. A boat moored where Pelham normally didn't tie his vessel, a scuff suggesting haste, and a missing locket. Her mind began to draw the lines between them. Thank you, Mr. Hargreaves, she said gently. That's a most helpful observation. Do you know who in the village owns a dinghy with a metal edge? Alf scratched his chin. Well, Dawlish keeps a little skiff, but it's all wood. Now, Captain Weatherby's old tender, he's got metal on the prow. Always said it stopped the gulls from pecking at it. Why? Miss Marple only smiled, as if the thought had been idle curiosity. By mid-morning, the mist had thinned, revealing 3 Shadows Isle across the water, its jagged silhouette standing stark against the horizon. The island seemed to hold its secrets tightly, the dark crags forming what almost looked like 3 hunched figures guarding a grave. Sylvia Partridge returned from the village with gossip spilling as freely as her shopping basket brimmed with rolls. Jane, you'll never believe it. Madame Zara's claiming the spirit of Pelham spoke to her last night. Says he whispered, "The sea hides the truth." And of course, half the village is in a tizzy. Miss Marple said mildly. Theatrical, isn't she? But theatrics often mask something more practical. One does wonder why she wishes to draw attention to the sea, when the truth is so often tucked away on land. Sylvia blinked. You think she knows something? Miss Marple didn't answer directly. Instead, she gathered her shawl and suggested they pay a polite call on the fortune-teller. Madame Zara's caravan sat near the edge of the village green, its painted sides bright with fading stars and moons. She answered the knock with her usual flourish, bracelets chiming as she opened the door. Miss Marple, Mrs. Partridge, do come in. I was just communing with the spirits. The air inside smelled of incense and damp velvet. Crystal balls and tarot decks sat scattered across a small round table. Such a sad affair, dear Jacob Pelham. Madame Zara sighed, fluttering her hands. The spirits weep for him. I imagine they must, Miss Marple said softly, glancing around the caravan. Her eyes, seemingly idle, took in a pair of muddy boots tucked half under a curtain, mud flecked with a fine silver grit like crushed shells. "You said you saw him on fête day?" Miss Marple said casually. Yet poor Mr. Pelham had already passed by then, according to Dr. Shaw's estimation. Madame Zara hesitated for just a breath. "Oh, well, perhaps I meant the day before. Time blurs when one communes with other worlds." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled kindly, though her mind registered the tremor in the woman's voice. A liar's tremor, and an attempt to cover a slip. Leaving the caravan, Sylvia hissed in a whisper, "Jane, did you see how nervous she was?" "I did," Miss Marple said serenely. "And I also saw something quite interesting on her boots. Mud from the island has a particular silver sheen due to the mica in its rocks. Very few people would recognize that. But I once saw a similar sparkle in Cornwall. If Madame Zara's boots wear island mud, she may have visited Three Shadows recently." Sylvia shivered. Then she could have been there with Pelham. "Perhaps," Miss Marple murmured. "Or she arrived after, which can be equally telling." That evening, the inspector called a meeting in the vicarage hall once again, this time with the air of a man ready to make an arrest. Henry Dawlish sat pale and hunched in a chair, while Captain Weatherby leaned against the wall, exuding smug certainty. Madame Zara swept in late, her expression tight despite the flamboyant tilt of her headscarf. "Ladies and gentlemen," Alderton said, "we have reason to believe Mr. Pelham's death was no accident. Certain evidence points toward foul play and a likely suspect." He turned toward Henry Dawlish, and a murmur rippled through the room. Henry stammered, I didn't do anything. I was home. Someone saw you by the quay the night before Pelham died," Alderton said crisply. Henry looked near to collapse, but Miss Marple's quiet voice cut through the tension. "I wonder, Inspector," she said, "if the presence of someone near the quay is proof of guilt, or simply proof that they were frightened. Young men often watch what they don't understand before they act rashly. And sometimes, the true culprit hides behind someone else's fear." Her gaze drifted, ever so casually, toward Madame Zara. The fortune-teller's hand twitched, and in that tiny tremor, Miss Marple felt the threads of the mystery begin to tighten around the right figure. The night settled over St. Hilary-on-Sea like a soft, dark shroud, the village lanes glimmering under the glow of a few gas lamps. Though the air was still and cool, a sense of unease threaded through the streets. In the harbor, the tide whispered against the stone steps, and somewhere far off, a gull gave a lonely cry. Inside Mrs. Partridge's cozy sitting room, the fire crackled, but Miss Marple's knitting needles lay untouched in her lap. Her mind was elsewhere, untangling a human knot far more complicated than any skein of yarn. Sylvia watched her friend with mild concern. "You're thinking, Jane. I can always tell. When you're thinking like this, it's either a rose that's been nipped by frost or a murder." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "It is curious, isn't it, how people reveal their hearts in the smallest ways. Our inspector sees a young man near the quay and immediately smells guilt. But people do not always stand where they are for the reasons we imagine. More often they are afraid, or perhaps hiding something entirely different from what one assumes." "Then you don't believe Henry Dawlish killed Jacob Pelham?" Miss Marple shook her head, her white curls catching the firelight. "I believe Henry knows something. But his fear strikes me as the fear of a witness, not a killer. And then there is Madame Zara, who spoke of spirits but could not quite keep her earthly boots free of island mud. her lie was a poor one. And Captain Weatherby, he is a man used to authority, but authority can be very convenient for concealing certain liberties. Sylvia shivered, pulling her shawl tighter. It's beginning to feel like everyone on this little coast has secrets. Miss Marple gave a soft, knowing chuckle. My dear, they always do. That is the constant of human nature. But tonight, I believe I should take a short walk. A mind clears best in the cool air, and I fancy the tide is just right for a little observation. And the village was mostly dark when Miss Marple stepped into the lane, her walking stick tapping softly on the stones. She moved with the deliberate pace of a frail old lady, but her eyes were sharp, darting toward the harbor where the water gleamed like black glass. Across the narrow inlet, Three Shadows Isle loomed, a jagged silhouette under a slice of moon. On the quay, she paused, listening. A soft splash broke the silence, then a faint metallic clink, as of chain against stone. Miss Marple's lips pressed together in satisfaction. Human behavior, she reflected, was as regular as the tide. People inevitably returned to the scene that tied them to danger. She crept quietly toward the source of the sound, using the harbor wall for cover. There, by the dim outline of a moored dinghy, a figure bent over, fiddling with the boat's rope. A scarf flapped slightly in the night breeze, catching the faint moonlight. Madame Zara. Miss Marple remained very still, watching. The fortune-teller tugged at something heavy in the boat, a burlap sack. After some effort, she lifted it onto the quay, glancing over her shoulder nervously. When she untied the knot, a dull glint caught the moonlight. It was a metal lantern, and beneath it, a bundle of objects wrapped in oilcloth. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. One small item slipped from the bundle and clattered softly to the stone. A locket, familiar from the gossiping tongues of the village. Pelham's missing locket. The fortune-teller swore under her breath and stuffed it back into the bundle, retying the sack. Then she dragged the whole thing behind a cluster of fishing crates, as if hiding it for later retrieval. Miss Marple retreated silently, retracing her steps before the woman could notice. By the time she returned to Mrs. Partridge's cottage, she felt the first real contour of the truth forming in her mind. Morning broke, with a brisk wind sweeping the mist out to sea, revealing the isle more clearly than before. It stood like a dark sentinel, its rocky spires reaching into the pale sky. Over breakfast, Sylvia prattled about the latest village rumors. Everyone says the inspector is going to arrest Henry today. Poor boy, he hasn't even had his tea in peace. And they say Captain Weatherby is helping with the search of the island. Miss Marple only nodded. Interesting. I believe I shall take a walk after our tea. The harbor will be busy this morning, I imagine. Sure enough, when they approached the quay, they found Inspector Alderton and Constable Miller preparing a small boat. Captain Weatherby was giving instructions in his booming, authoritative voice. Henry Dawlish stood nearby, pale as the sea foam, while Madame Zara lingered on the fringe of the crowd, her painted smile slightly strained. "Ah, Miss Marple," Alderton said, doffing his cap politely. "We're going to have a proper look at Three Shadows Isle. Can't leave any stone unturned. Might even find Mr. Pelham's missing trinkets. Likely the boy pawned them off somewhere." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, her voice mild. "Do be careful with stones, Inspector. Some of them, when turned, reveal quite the unexpected." She walked along the quay as if merely curious, her sharp eyes sliding toward the stack of fishing crates where Madame Zara had hidden the sack the previous night. This morning, the sack was gone. By mid-afternoon, the party returned from the island, damp and irritable. Alderton had a face like thunder. "Nothing," he grumbled. "Not a blasted thing but seabird nests and slippery rocks. And the tide'll be up soon, so that's that." Miss Marple's expression was serene, but inside, her mind hummed. Zara had retrieved her hidden items. The inspector had found nothing. This was the moment to set the stage. That evening, Miss Marple paid a call to Madame Zara, her manner all flutter and sympathy. "My dear," she said softly, "I do hope this business hasn't been too trying for you. People can be so unkind when tragedy strikes. They whisper, they point. And I have seen, in my many years, how such whispers can turn against a person with alarming speed." The fortune-teller shifted uneasily, her bracelets jingling. "Whispers are just ignorance, Miss Marple. I've done nothing wrong." "Oh, I am sure you believe that," Miss Marple said sweetly. "But I should tell you. Inspector Alderton is very determined to find Pelham's locket. Such things are always, in the end, discovered. And when they are discovered, well, the person who hid them is rarely forgiven." Madame Zara blanched, her hands freezing mid-gesture. For one instant, her eyes darted toward the back of the caravan. That involuntary glance was all Miss Marple needed. "Good evening, my dear," Miss Marple said gently, retreating before the woman could compose a lie. As she walked back to the cottage, she allowed herself the smallest, most satisfied smile. The trap was nearly set. The following morning, St. Hilary-on-Sea awoke to the sound of gulls and the restless muttering of a village on edge. News had traveled faster than the tide that no evidence had been found on Three Shadows Isle. Yet suspicion had only grown thicker. In the snug corner of the Salted Anchor, the local inn, Isolk, fishermen nursed their mugs and gossiped in low tones, while Mrs. Partridge's niece could be heard whispering in the bakery queue that the fortune-teller must have called down the devil himself. Miss Marple, strolling to the post office as serenely as if the world were perfectly ordinary, took in the subtleties of human behavior that others ignored. Captain Weatherby was standing stiffly near the harbor, glaring toward Henry Dawlish, who was attempting to repair a frayed rope while his hands trembled. Madame Zara's caravan curtains remained drawn tight, though a faint wisp of smoke curled from her chimney, betraying her nervous occupation within. Miss Marple paused at the post office to purchase a packet of stamps, all the while listening to Mr. Trelawney, the postmaster, who was speaking to a villager in a loud, aggrieved whisper. "And I told the inspector, didn't I? That island's cursed. Pelham was a fool to poke about at night. Now this young Dawlish is as good as done for, mark my words. No one else has any business skulking round in the dark." Miss Marple, pocketing her stamps, gave a gentle, almost apologetic smile. "Human beings do have the oddest impulses when frightened, Mr. Trelawney. They often run toward danger rather than away from it, though, of course, not always for the reasons we assume." The postmaster blinked at her, uncertain how to reply, and Miss Marple toddled on. While that afternoon, she paid a call to the inspector. Alderton, a broad, practical man with a perpetual sunburn from years on the coast, was clearly frustrated. His desk was a litter of notes, the topmost being a list of every villager who had been near the quay the night of Pelham's disappearance. "Miss Marple," he said with a sigh, "I hope you're not here to defend that boy again. Everyone saw him loitering near the quay. And Pelham's locket is missing. I'd wager a week's wages Henry took it, tried to pawn it, and, well, things went too far." Miss Marple lowered herself gently into a chair and folded her hands. "Oh, I dare say your instincts are correct as far as they go, Inspector. But do you not find it Interesting that everyone seems so very ready to see Henry as the culprit. Human nature, you know. People are happiest when guilt rests elsewhere. But guilt, like water, has a way of seeping through the cracks until it reveals its true source. The inspector gave her a long-suffering look, muttered something about old ladies and riddles, and returned to his notes. Miss Marple, having planted the seed of doubt, made her way to the harbor once more. It was near twilight when the second shock came. A scream pierced the quiet evening, sharp and terrible, carrying over the water. Villagers rushed to the quay, their voices rising in panic. There, at the foot of the stone steps leading to the harbor, lay Madame Zara, her bright scarf soaking in the shallow water, her face as pale as the rising moon. "She's dead," cried Sylvia, clutching Miss Marple's arm. The inspector arrived moments later, pushing through the crowd. He knelt to examine the body and frowned. No wounds. She must have slipped and struck her head on the steps. Tide carried her down just far enough to drown. Miss Marple's blue eyes were sharp beneath her soft white curls. "Yes," she said softly, "slipped, or was helped along." Several villagers crossed themselves. Captain Weatherby, who had arrived puffing and red-faced, declared loudly, "It's that cursed island. First Pelham, now this. We should board the place up, blow the rocks to kingdom come." But Miss Marple was not looking at the captain. She was watching Henry Dawlish, who stood frozen at the edge of the gathering, his eyes darting between the body and the dark water beyond the quay. Terror had carved deep lines into his young face. "Henry," she said gently, "did you see anything?" He flinched as though struck, then shook his head violently. "No, Miss Marple, I wasn't here, I swear it. I don't know anything." Yet his trembling hands and quivering voice told Miss Marple he knew something he dared not say. By nightfall, the village was in chaos. Rumors roared through the streets. That Madame Zara had been cursed, that she had been pushed, that she had confessed to the vicar hours before her death. Every scrap of gossip was embellished, and the inspector was nearly shouting by the time Miss Marple arrived quietly at the scene of the death. Now deserted, except for Alderton and Constable Miller. She hid her head on that third step, Alderton said, shining his lantern over the slick stone. "Slippery as sin, but the tide's low enough that she could have caught herself on the wall if she'd tried. Almost like she didn't fight it." Miss Marple bent carefully, her small shadow stretching long in the lamplight. Her sharp eyes scanned the steps, the water line, and the faint trail where a shoe had scuffed on the upper stone. Then she noticed something glinting under the edge of the quay. She stooped, plucked it out, and held it up delicately between two fingers. It was a bracelet of colored glass beads, soaked and darkened by seawater. She recognized it at once. Madame Zara had been wearing it the night she dragged her secret sack into hiding. "Inspector," Miss Marple said, her voice mild, "does it not strike you as peculiar that Madame Zara's bracelet should be wedged here, rather than floating off with the tide? As though it were caught in a sudden grasp?" Alderton frowned. "Are you saying someone grabbed her?" "I am saying," Miss Marple said, rising carefully, "that human nature is very obliging. People will always reveal their intentions, if one knows how to look. Madame Zara knew a secret, a very inconvenient secret. And secrets, Inspector, are often fatal in small places like St. Hilary." She turned her face toward the dark silhouette of Three Shadows Isle. In the distance, a lantern flickered on the shore, one small, wavering light against the vastness of night. Miss Marple allowed herself a tiny nod. Pieces were sliding into place, and with them came a creeping certainty. The murderer was among them, moving like the tide, leaving faint ripples in human behavior that only the most patient observer could follow. Tomorrow, she resolved, she would set her quiet trap. And this time, someone would betray themselves completely. The morning after Madame Zara's death dawned pale and wind-streaked, as if the sea itself shared in the village's unease. St. Hilary-on-Sea was wrapped in a strange hush, broken only by the distant cry of gulls and the rhythmic clatter of boat masts against the harbor poles. In the bakery, customers whispered instead of chattered, and the milkman made his rounds without singing, as he usually did. The deaths. First, Jacob Pelham's disappearance, and now the fortune-teller's drowning, had cast a shadow as deep as the one from the brooding isle offshore. Miss Marple observed this quiet transformation from the window of Mrs. Partridge's sitting room, her knitting lying neglected in her lap. She sipped her tea, eyes fixed on the harbor. To the casual eye, she seemed like an elderly lady lost in morning thoughts, but in truth, she was mapping the invisible lines of guilt and fear that threaded through the village. She had spent a lifetime studying human nature in the most innocent of places: church fetes, garden parties, sewing circles. She had learned that people always betrayed themselves, not in grand confessions, but in small habits, glances, or sudden slips of tongue. St. Hilary was a village on the verge of such a slip. "Jane," said Sylvia, fussing with her shawl as she came in, "the inspector's in a state. He's all but shouting at poor Henry Dawlish on the quay. I fear the boy will be locked up before luncheon." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "Poor Henry. He is frightened, yes. But I do not think he is frightened of justice, only of truth. There is a difference, my dear." Sylvia blinked. "Truth? You think he knows who did this?" Miss Marple set down her teacup and rose with slow, deliberate grace. "Oh, I believe Henry knows rather more than he intends to. The trouble with fear is that it often silences the innocent as effectively as the guilty. But the time has come for a little gentle encouragement." Down by the quay, the wind carried the scent of salt and seaweed. Inspector Alderton was red-faced with frustration, Henry Dawlish cowering under his scrutiny. A small crowd had gathered, a mix of fishermen, housewives, and curious children, their voices rising and falling in urgent whispers. "Boy was seen lurking again last night," Alderton barked. "And now, Madame Zara's dead. You were out on that quay, weren't you?" Henry stammered. I only went to see if... His throat closed on the words, and his eyes darted to the harbor, then toward Three Shadows Isle. Miss Marple approached, leaning on her walking stick, and the inspector groaned audibly. "Not now, Miss Marple, please. I'm making progress here." "My dear inspector," she said, her voice soft but clear. "If I might make an observation. It is terribly difficult to coax truth from a frightened young man when you loom over him like an angry gull. Perhaps if you gave him a little room, his memory might loosen." Alderton grumbled but stepped back. The villagers, curious and half in awe of the unassuming old lady, quieted. Miss Marple settled herself on a low stone wall, her expression kindly. "Henry, my dear, the sea is a fearful place at night, isn't it? The sound of the water against the steps, the way the lanterns flicker. One might easily imagine all sorts of dreadful things." Henry swallowed hard. I didn't hurt her, Miss Marple. I swear it. I never touched her." "I know you didn't," she said gently. "But you saw something, didn't you? Something that made your heart stop and your feet feel like lead. People don't tremble for no reason at all." The boy's face crumpled. He looked around desperately, then leaned closer, his voice barely a whisper. I saw someone on the steps, just after she screamed. He pushed her. The crowd gasped, and Alderton snapped upright. Who, boy? Who was it? Henry's eyes flicked instinctively toward the edge of the quay, where Captain Weatherby stood glowering, his heavy boots planted like anchors. Then, just as quickly, he dropped his gaze, lips clamped tight. Miss Marple's heart gave a small, grim flutter. Confirmation was often no louder than a glance. That evening, Miss Marple began to set her subtle trap. She had long learned that the guilty rarely confessed of their own accord. They required a small stage upon which to enact their guilt, to step into their own ruin. She arranged a quiet gathering at Mrs. Partridge's cottage under the pretense of restoring calm to the village. A pot of tea steamed on the table, and a plate of currant scones waited in the center. Sylvia busied herself with the cups as Miss Marple issued soft invitations around the harbor that afternoon. By nightfall, Henry Dawlish, Inspector Alderton, Captain Weatherby, and even the vicar had found their way into the warm little room, lured by curiosity and the promise of a calm ear. My dears, Miss Marple began, knitting in hand. We are all tired of fear, are we not? Poor Madame Zara. So very unfortunate. I find myself wondering what she wished to tell us before her untimely death. Captain Weatherby shifted in his chair, the leather of his boots creaking. Probably some nonsense about ghosts. The woman was half mad. Oh, I don't know, Miss Marple said mildly. She seemed quite aware of earthly matters. Why, I happened to notice the charming bracelet she always wore, the one she lost last night, just at the water's edge. The room went still. Weatherby's jaw tightened, and Henry watched him with wide, fearful eyes. Bracelet? Alderton said sharply. Yes, Miss Marple said, eyes fixed on her knitting. Wedged in a most interesting place, as if caught in a final, desperate grasp. One wonders whose hand she might have reached for, or against, in her last moment. A bead of sweat trickled down Weatherby's temple. His fingers drummed on the arm of his chair. I wouldn't know anything about that, he muttered. Oh, I think you do, Miss Marple said softly, without looking up. It is in human nature to cling to a final hope, Captain. Madame Zara reached for someone, and in doing so, left us a little story written in beads and water. A story that tells us she was not alone when she fell. The silence was thick, broken only by the hiss of the kettle. Then Henry, emboldened by the old lady's quiet certainty, whispered, It was you. I saw you on the steps. You shoved her. Weatherby sprang to his feet, his face mottled red. Lies! She was blackmailing me. The room erupted into shouts, the inspector barking for calm, the vicar muttering a prayer. Miss Marple remained seated, her needles clicking once more. She had not needed to accuse him directly. Guilt had done the work for her. Captain Weatherby's outburst had opened the door to the truth. Blackmail, fear, and desperation were all tangled together, and Miss Marple could see the full pattern at last. The trap had sprung, but the story of the Whispering Isle was not yet finished. There were still missing pieces. Jacob Pelham's fate, the secret Madame Zara had held, and the final act that would lay the entire mystery bare. Miss Marple, serene as ever, rose and adjusted her shawl. Inspector, I believe we are very close now. The tide waits for no man, and neither does justice. Tomorrow morning, I think we shall all take one last little trip to Three Shadows Isle. There we shall find what the sea has tried very hard to keep. Her eyes, bright and cold as the northern wind, flicked toward Weatherby. And perhaps, Captain, you will finally understand that secrets, like tides, can only be held back for so long. The next morning, a pale mist rolled off the sea, curling through the narrow lanes of St. Hilary on Sea and clinging to the harbor like an unspoken warning. Miss Marple, wrapped in her sensible gray coat and woolen scarf, stood at the edge of the quay, her eyes fixed on the jagged silhouette of Three Shadows Isle. It loomed in the distance, three black humps of rock rising from the foam, as though three sleeping beasts waited to awaken. Inspector Alderton shuffled beside her, looking distinctly uneasy. Captain Weatherby, grim and silent under guard, stood with his arms crossed. The small launch, borrowed from the harbor master, bobbed gently against the stone steps, its oars glinting with morning dew. Henry Dawlish clutched a coil of rope, his knuckles white, as if the sea itself might leap up to accuse him. "I must say, Miss Marple," the inspector muttered, his breath fogging in the chill, "I don't like the idea of this trip one bit. It's a wretched place. And with Weatherby here, well, I'd rather have had him in a cell." "My dear Inspector," Miss Marple replied mildly, "a man who has stumbled into his own guilt is often more useful than one locked away. And besides, the isle is quite small. We shan't lose him." They pushed off into the fog, the oars dipping with soft, rhythmic splashes. The harbor shrank behind them until the cottages looked like toys, and the church spire became a gray needle against the sky. Henry rowed silently, his face pale, and Miss Marple sat serenely, as if she were merely on a pleasant outing to admire the seabirds. Three Shadows Isle grew larger with each pull of the oars. The jagged rocks at its base were slick with seaweed, and the cries of gulls echoed off the stone walls of a ruined tower that crowned the center rise. The tide was low enough to reveal a narrow strip of pebbled beach, and the sea whispered as it receded, leaving behind rivulets that shimmered like silver threads. "Land us there, Henry," Miss Marple instructed softly, "by that dark patch near the rocks. I should like to start where the sea and the land meet. Most secrets wash ashore eventually." As her boots touched the wet stones, Miss Marple paused, listening. The air smelled of brine and decay. Somewhere, water dripped into a hidden pool, and the wind hissed through the cracks in the old tower like a whispering ghost. It was an inhospitable place, and yet she felt that it had been watched. Haunted not by spirits, but by the human kind of malice that lingered after dark deeds. "Spread out," Alderton ordered gruffly. "Check the rocks, and mind your footing, all of you." Henry and the inspector moved toward the tower, while Miss Marple bent to examine the pebbled shore. Her old eyes, still keen and curious, traced the outlines of the tide's gifts. A few shards of broken shell, a length of frayed rope, and, half buried in wet sand, the gleam of something small and metallic. She stooped and plucked it free. A silver button, tarnished but intact. A sailor's button, or perhaps from a heavy peacoat. She glanced toward Captain Weatherby. He was watching her, his lips pressed tight, as though each discovery drew him nearer to a precipice he could no longer avoid. "Miss Marple." Henry's voice carried a tremor. "Over here, by the pool." They hurried to the tide pool at the island's center, nestled between jagged rocks. Its surface was still, reflecting the gray sky, and from beneath the water glimmered the outline of something pale and unmistakable. Inspector Alderton cursed under his breath and waded in up to his knees. Moments later, he heaved out a heavy, sodden bundle, a man's coat stiff with salt, and within it, the skeletal remains of Jacob Pelham. The skull stared upward, the jaw open as if caught in a final silent cry. Henry gagged and turned away. Captain Weatherby shut his eyes briefly, and Miss Marple only sighed, her expression tinged with quiet inevitability. "Poor Mr. Pelham," she murmured. "The sea kept him, but not forever." Alderton was grim. "We've got our murder, all right, and I expect we'll tie it straight to our captain here." Weatherby's voice cracked. "I didn't kill Pelham. Zara found the body and threatened to tell. She said she'd seen me that night and that everyone would think I'd done it. But I only moved him." Miss Marple tilted her head, her voice still calm. "Moved him? And why would a man risk rowing to an island at night to move a body if he were innocent?" I owed him money," Weatherby stammered. "The man drank and gambled. I lent him what I shouldn't have. Then he went missing, and Zara, she said she'd ruin me if I didn't pay her to keep quiet. I thought if I hid the body, they'd never prove anything." "The bracelet," Miss Marple said softly. "She wore it that night to make certain you followed her to the quay. And when she fell, she reached for the man who feared exposure more than justice. Poor woman. In the end, her own trade, secrets, brought her to her death." The inspector looked to Miss Marple. "And the boy?" She shook her head. Henry saw too much and understood too little. It is always the young and the gentle who suffer for the sins of the fearful. By the time they returned to the harbor, the fog had lifted, and the sun broke through the clouds, gilding the water with pale light. The village was waiting for them, breathless. When they saw the inspector leading Weatherby away in irons, and the truth spilling quietly from Miss Marple's lips, a wave of relieved murmurs spread like ripples in the tide. Miss Marple, having done her quiet work, returned to Mrs. Partridge's cottage for tea. She sat by the window with her knitting, the faint cries of gulls and the distant toll of the church bell drifting through the air. "Terrible business," Mrs. Partridge muttered, shivering. "I do hope that's the last of it." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Oh, my dear, there is never an end to such things. Human nature is like the tide, forever moving, sometimes gentle, sometimes treacherous. But for now, the sea has given back its secrets, and St. Hilary may rest again." She clicked her knitting needles together, her thoughts already wandering toward the next quiet corner of the world, where human folly would one day whisper its dark story into her waiting ears. The village of St. Hilary-on-Sea awoke the next morning with a peculiar sense of fragile calm. The news of Captain Weatherby's arrest had spread through the cottages and shops like a brisk wind off the channel, carrying both relief and unease in equal measure. Though the murderer, or so most believed, was now in custody, the tale of the Whispering Isle was far from settled in the hearts and minds of the villagers. Miss Marple, however, knew that the human heart seldom rests on the first story it's given. She had spent the evening in quiet reflection by Mrs. Partridge's fireside, sipping chamomile tea while her knitting needles clicked softly. Her mind, nimble as ever, replayed every whisper of conversation, every fleeting glance, every small act of human folly that had passed before her in the last week. She had listened to the villagers in the post office and in the tea room, seen the unspoken fears behind their words, and allowed the truth to arrange itself in the simple, relentless pattern that always revealed itself to those who truly understood human nature. And so, that morning, she rose early, dressed in her neat blue cardigan and sturdy walking shoes, and made her way toward the inspector's temporary office. a modest room at the back of the harbormaster's building. Inside, Inspector Alderton sat with the weariness of a man who had both solved and not solved a case. He looked up as Miss Marple entered. "Good morning, madam," he said, with a mixture of respect and fatigue. "We've a confession of sorts from Weatherby, but it's an odd one. He admits to moving Pelham's body, as he said on the aisle, but swears blind he didn't kill him. Says he only wanted to keep the scandal quiet." "And Zara?" Miss Marple asked gently, taking the wooden chair opposite him. "Dead because she knew too much," the inspector replied, shaking his head. "Fell from the key in the struggle. Open and shut to my mind." Miss Marple's smile was faint but indulgent, the sort one might give to a well-meaning child. "It is a comfort, Inspector, that the world appears simple when one wishes it to be. But the world, in my experience, is very seldom simple. May I suggest we gather all interested parties for a small conversation?" Alderton hesitated. He had seen that look before. Quiet, unwavering, utterly certain. "You mean, like in those detective novels, where everyone is gathered and the truth comes out?" Miss Marple folded her hands on her lap. "My dear Inspector, novels often mimic life, but life is far more revealing when one simply lets people's own consciences do the work." By mid-morning, the harbormaster's hall was crowded. The suspects and witnesses came reluctantly, drawn by the irresistible pull of village curiosity. Henry Dawlish, pale and trembling, sat in the corner, twisting his cap in his hands. Mrs. Alderney, the innkeeper's wife, hovered by the doorway, eager for any new morsel of scandal. Even Reverend Chillingford had arrived, his long face drawn in pious disapproval at the entire sordid affair. Captain Weatherby, under guard but unshackled, sat at the table, looking 10 years older than he had the week before. His eyes, bloodshot and rimmed with shame, avoided the curious stares of his neighbors. Miss Marple waited until the low murmur of gossip had faded into expectant silence. She rose with the air of someone about to discuss nothing more exciting than the weather. "My friends," she began, "it seems our little village has suffered greatly in the past week. 2 deaths and the sea itself compelled to give up its long-held secret. And yet, even now, I fear we are not entirely honest with ourselves about what truly happened on and around Three Shadows Isle." She let her words settle. The only sound was the faint gull cry outside the window. "Inspector Alderton is correct," she continued, "that Captain Weatherby is guilty of something, though not, I believe, of the crime of murder. His guilt is the ordinary, human sort: fear, foolishness, and a desperate attempt to conceal his own indiscretions. But the true murderer of Jacob Pelham, and by extension of poor Zara, has been sitting among us, quite confident that the story would end here." A collective intake of breath followed. Mrs. Alderney's eyes gleamed with barely restrained delight. Miss Marple moved her gaze, slow and measured, over the room. "Consider first Mr. Pelham," she said, softly. "A man fond of drink, careless with money, and rather too free with his tongue. He quarreled with more than one of you. He had debts, and not merely to Captain Weatherby. There is a certain type of man who preys on weakness like his, who smiles in public but sharpens his knife in private." Henry Dawlish whimpered softly in the corner, and the inspector shot him a sharp look. "Henry, my dear," Miss Marple said gently, "you were a witness to part of the truth, but your fear blinded you to the whole. You saw a man on the quay the night Pelham vanished, didn't you?" Henry nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. Yes, ma'am. I saw the captain, or I thought I did." and someone else. But it was dark. Yes, Miss Marple said. It was dark. And that someone else has been hoping all along that the captain's panic would carry the blame. But you see, I noticed something very small, something human, but telling. When the sea returned Mr. Pelham to us, there was a button missing from his coat. I found it on the shore of the isle. Not a sailor's button, as the inspector assumed, but a workman's. Brass, slightly dented. And yesterday, in the midst of all this excitement, I observed that someone in this very room had replaced a missing button on his own coat with a mismatched piece, hastily sewn. Her gaze settled on Mr. Clegg, the harbor master's assistant, a stout man who had been silent throughout. He started, his mouth working soundlessly. "You lent Mr. Pelham money, did you not?" Miss Marple said softly. "With interest. When he could not pay, you lured him to the quay under the pretense of settling accounts. A struggle ensued. He fell, struck his head, and you, terrified of ruin, rolled him into the sea, trusting the current to carry away your problem." "No," Clegg cried, lurching to his feet. "It was an accident. I didn't mean to." The inspector was already moving, seizing his arms as the villagers gasped. Miss Marple's voice, calm as ever, cut through the din. "And when Zara saw the quarrel and realized the truth, you tried to frighten her into silence. But blackmailers, as I have often observed, rarely keep quiet for long. She threatened to tell, and when she followed Weatherby to the quay that last night, your attempt to frighten her ended as tragically as your first." Clegg sagged in the inspector's grip, his shoulders shaking. "I never meant. Lord help me, I never meant." Miss Marple sighed. "Human nature seldom intends all its consequences, Mr. Clegg. That is why it fascinates me so." And the room gradually emptied, leaving only the inspector and Miss Marple. Outside, the gulls wheeled over the sunlit harbor, and the villagers began their next cycle of whispers. Alderton rubbed his face, shaking his head. "I don't know how you do it, ma'am. All I had was a guilty sailor and a heap of bones. And you, well, you saw everything else." Miss Marple smiled faintly, adjusting her gloves. "One only needs to watch, Inspector. People will tell you everything about themselves, if you have the patience to see what they try to hide. And besides," she added with a twinkle in her eye, "one sees much the same thing in villages, whether they are inland or by the sea. Pride, fear, greed. They travel as easily as the tide." She rose, taking her leave. The sun broke fully over St. Hilary-on-Sea, and for now, the Whispering Isle lay silent once more. The small village of St. Hilary-on-Sea began to settle back into its usual rhythms in the days following Mr. Clegg's arrest. Yet there was a lingering air of unease that drifted through the cobbled streets and across the quiet harbor like the morning mist. Life, as it often did, moved forward. Boats still left with the tide, post was delivered, and the bell at St. Hilary's church tolled as faithfully as ever. But the villagers carried the shadow of the recent events with them. Mrs. Alderney, ever the unofficial herald of gossip, could be heard recounting the tale to anyone who would listen. By the time she told it to the vicar's wife, the story had grown to include ghostly lights on the Whispering Isle and a spectral figure in a long coat pushing Pelham into the sea. The vicar, to his credit, reminded her gently that Miss Marple had provided the truth in full. But it was no use. Human nature, Miss Marple thought, preferred its stories with just a touch of the fanciful. Miss Marple herself remained quietly at Mrs. Partridge's cottage, finishing her stay in the village with her usual unobtrusive grace. She spent her mornings tending the small window boxes of geraniums, her afternoons knitting by the fire, and her evenings observing the slow, careful dance of a village returning to normal. People always assumed that after the storm came calm, but Miss Marple knew better. After the storm, there was always a brief hush, a watchful pause, before life's routines stitched themselves together again, patching over the rip in human behavior that had been exposed. One such afternoon, Inspector Alderton came to call. He found her seated at the small oak table, knitting needles clinking softly, a fresh pot of tea steaming beside her. "Ma'am," he said as he removed his cap, his voice low with a mixture of respect and thoughtfulness. "I wanted to thank you truly. Without your insight, I dare say we'd have closed this case on Weatherby and left the real murderer free." Miss Marple smiled, motioning for him to pour himself some tea. "You give me too much credit, Inspector. I only observe what is before me. And people, dear, complicated people, always give themselves away if one watches carefully enough." Alderton took the tea, staring into its amber depths as though it might offer wisdom of its own. "I can't help thinking how easily it might have all been avoided. Pelham dead over a handful of debts and threats, Zara too, for nothing more than being in the wrong place. Ordinary lives, ruined by fear and greed." Miss Marple's expression softened. "Yes, it is a pity. But, you know, I have long thought that most crimes, particularly the cruelest ones, are born not of great evil, but of small, ordinary weaknesses left unchecked. A moment of panic, a spark of anger, and then all the tidy morals of the world are washed away like footprints in the sand." The inspector nodded slowly. "I suppose that's true." He hesitated, then added, "Mr. Clegg's trial will be in the city. He's confessed to it all now, said he never meant to kill anyone, that it all just happened. I reckon he'll hang all the same." Miss Marple paused her knitting, looking out the window at the harbor, where gulls wheeled over the silver-green water. "Perhaps he will. But I cannot help but think that his punishment began the moment he saw Mr. Pelham's body sink beneath the tide. Some weights are carried long before the gallows." They sat in silence for a moment, listening to the faint echo of the sea and the whisper of the wind in the chimney. Then Miss Marple, with the slightest of smiles, returned to her knitting. "And so the village will settle again. It always does. But I imagine there will be fewer night walks to the quay for some time." The inspector chuckled softly, taking his leave, and Miss Marple resumed her quiet occupation. At the next morning, she prepared to depart St. Hilary-on-Sea. Mrs. Partridge fussed over her like a mother hen, insisting on sending her off with a wrapped parcel of scones and a jar of her best quince marmalade. "Oh, Miss Marple, I don't know what we'd have done without you," she said, wringing her hands. "And to think, our little village. 2 murders in 1 week. Why, I dare say the London papers will be calling us a den of iniquity before long." Miss Marple smiled, tucking the parcel into her handbag. "I should not worry, my dear. Villages are much like people. They carry their scars quietly. Before long, this will all be a story told in lowered voices over tea, and life will appear quite as peaceful as it did before. Appearances, of course," she added gently, "are always a matter of perspective." Mrs. Partridge sniffed and dabbed at her eyes as Miss Marple stepped into the morning light. The air smelled of salt and wet stone, and the tide was already creeping out, bearing the slick sand of the harbor floor. Across the water, the dark hulk of Three Shadows Isle sat solemn and silent, its secrets finely laid bare. Miss Marple paused for a moment, watching the gulls rise and fall over the tide. She thought of Mr. Pelham, of Zara, of Mr. Clegg and Captain Weatherby. and of all the invisible threads of fear, greed, and pride that had drawn them together on those fateful nights. Human nature, she reflected, was as constant as the sea, always shifting in its surface moods, yet utterly predictable in its tides. With that, she turned toward the small railway station, her step light, her heart as steady as ever. The village would continue, the sea would whisper, and Miss Marple, ever patient, ever watchful, would carry on to the next quiet place where life appeared simple and safe, and where, inevitably, someone's small, fatal weakness would tell its tale to the one person willing to listen. And far behind her, the whispering isle kept its silence, as though waiting for the next secret to be carried to its lonely shores. Miss Marple sat in the vicarage drawing room, her delicate hands folded neatly over her knitting, though the needles had fallen still for the moment. Around her, the last gathering of villagers had assembled. Inspector Alderton, his face tense but curious, Mrs. Alderney, breathless with anticipation, Captain Weatherby, pale but defiant, and the nervous Mr. Clegg, wringing his cap between clammy fingers. The fire snapped and popped, the soft tick of the mantel clock filling the gaps of heavy silence. Miss Marple looked up, her blue eyes mild but sharp beneath the curls of white hair. She began speaking as if she were recounting a story to a child, her tone calm and even. You see, it was all rather simple once one understood human nature. Mr. Pelham was a bully, clever in his cruelty, and used to holding others in his power. He knew Mr. Clegg had been stealing small sums from the shipping accounts. He knew Captain Weatherby, though respected, had a past he wished to remain buried. And he knew poor Zara had become privy to more than she should have, though I dare say she did not realize the danger she was in. Weatherby shifted in his chair, his jaw tightening, but he said nothing. The first death, that of Mr. Pelham, was not premeditated in the usual sense, Miss Marple continued, her voice soft, but carrying to every ear in the room. It was born of fear and desperation. Mr. Clegg went to meet him that night on the quay, intending to beg or bribe him into silence. Words were exchanged, harsh words, cruel words, and Mr. Pelham, as he often did, pushed too far. A shove, a struggle, and into the water he went. A man who has blackmailed his neighbors for years does not usually inspire anyone to leap in after him. There was a ripple of murmured shock. Clegg's head sank into his hands. But then came the second death. Poor Zara, Miss Marple went on, her voice tinged with quiet sadness. She had seen Mr. Clegg leaving the quay. She thought perhaps she could warn someone, or perhaps she hesitated too long. It does not matter. By the next evening, she had gone to confront him, or perhaps simply to speak to him. And Mr. Clegg, in his panic, silenced her forever. A man in such a state sees threats everywhere, even in kindness. Clegg sobbed once, a low, strangled sound that made Mrs. Alderney gasp and clutch her pearls. Inspector Alderton leaned forward. We found Zara's scarf in his shed. That sealed it, he said grimly. Miss Marple gave a small nod. Quite. But it was not the scarf that first told me the truth. It was Mr. Clegg himself. When the first body was discovered, he was the only man who did not go to the quay to watch the commotion. Instead, he busied himself with polishing the same bit of brass in his doorway, over and over. Not because he didn't care, but because he cared far too much. Avoidance is as telling as panic if you know what to look for. She let her words settle over the room, the only sound the fire's soft crackle. Mr. Clegg, fear and guilt have been your companions these last days. And it is often the case, I have found, that a person who commits such acts is punished long before the law takes its course. You will have time yet to reflect on the choices that brought you here. There was nothing more to be said. Inspector Alderton rose, gently but firmly taking Mr. Clegg by the arm. The man shuffled toward the door, shoulders slumped, as the murmurs of the villagers followed him into the night. In the days that followed, St. Hilary-on-Sea began its slow return to the semblance of normalcy. The tide continued to rise and fall, the gulls wheeled above the harbor, and the dark outline of Three Shadows Isle sat silent on the horizon. But a certain caution crept into the villagers' habits. Doors were locked a bit earlier, gossip was shared in quieter voices, and more than one fisherman cast a wary glance toward the quay on foggy nights. Miss Marple, satisfied that justice, of a kind, had been done, prepared to return to St. Mary Mead. She took her leave with a warm smile and a jar of Mrs. Partridge's quince marmalade tucked safely in her bag. As the train pulled away from the little seaside station, Miss Marple gazed out at the silver water one last time. She thought of the lives that had unraveled over small, ordinary sins: fear, pride, and greed. It was always the same, she mused. Human nature was the only map a true detective ever needed. And as the Whispering Isle faded into the mist behind her, she picked up her knitting, the quiet rhythm of the needles as steady as the turning of the tide.